Okay, I'm back. This is Unit 3, and this is video number 4. And in this video, we're talking about all of the different kinds of cultural identity, whether it be race, whether it be ethnicity, gender, or sexuality. So we'll start with race, and we'll progress on through from race to ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. And unfortunately, race is one of those things that historically has been massively troubling throughout human history. People use skin color as a divisive characteristic, and the sad reality is that race is a human constructed ideology. There's no difference biologically between humans. Skin color is usually a result of melanin in the skin, and the people living in the middle latitudes develop darker skin to protect their skin from the sun's rays. People that lived at the higher latitudes were whiter because they didn't have as much sunlight, and their skin was much more transparent to be able to absorb the vitamin D. So again, race is something where appearance is a poor predictor of who somebody is. And it's not often race that's the real characteristic, it's place. In the United States, we use race all the time when talking about educational, learning, achievement gaps. And really, the number one predictor of academic success in America is family income. It's not about the racial background of the student, it's about what advantages or disadvantages has the student had in accessing the educational system and learning. So when we think about race and appearance of people, there's a really cool guy you can follow. It's called Where the Hell is Matt? And it's this guy Matt. He lives in the Pacific Northwest, I think in Washington somewhere, and he travels around the world. And wherever he goes, he always dances with people. And basically, the idea is he's trying to show that despite the fact that we think we're so very, very different, the reality is that humans are very similar. We all kind of want and need the same things. So, what are the differences? When we think of race, oftentimes we're thinking about ethnic, religious, nationality, cultural identity issues. One of the worst modern genocides was in Rwanda. If you ever see the movie Hotel Rwanda, it's a great documentary, not a documentary, Hollywood movie, but it documents the historical episodes of that genocide in Rwanda that occurred in the 90s. We've talked in class about Rohingya Muslims being targeted in predominantly Buddhist Myanmar. You guys, of course, probably have heard of the troubles in Northern Ireland between Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics. U2 made their whole career basically out of the experiences of that time period in Ireland. The Arab-Israeli conflict between Israel and Palestine. Again, we always think of it as being an ethnic, religious-based conflict. The reality is they're fighting over land. Yugoslavia, the Balkanization, the violent breakup of a country. Everybody in that conflict, the Serbs and the Croats, were both Slavic. They had religious differences. The Serbs were Orthodox, the Croats were Catholics, but they spoke the same language. Although today, people will tell you that Serbo-Croatian is no longer a single language, that it's now somehow split over time and over distance. So when we think about differences, a lot of times humans invent differences and they magnify differences and they really, make those differences insurmountable by attitudes and intolerance of people who are different. So this is a map that shows you the basic breakdown in the breakup of Yugoslavia. The Serbs in Serbia and, of course, the Croats in Croatia. Stuck in the middle was the poor country of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnians were overwhelmingly Muslim, although there were Serbs living there, there were Croats living there. When Serbia and Croatia were fighting each other, Bosnia was stuck in the middle. The city of Sarajevo, it hosted the Olympics, the Winter Olympic Games of 1984, a beautiful historical city, and it was reduced to near rubble during this conflict in the late 90s. So when we think about in the United States, we have some of these same racial, ethnic, religious, immigrant, gender-based divisions that have separated us for a long time and continuing to do so today. The United States, remember, is the country where we have a document that says that all men are created equal. written by a man who owned slaves. We have a constitution setting out the rights of all Americans, except, of course, for those who were enslaved. And because of haggling over how we were going to count population, they came up with this compromise known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, where they were going to count black people as three-fifths of a person. So in our country, we have this historically. Even the Emancipation Proclamation that Lincoln issued during the Civil War, famously, people say, "Oh, he freed the slaves." Yeah, he freed the slaves living in the parts of the country that he did not have jurisdiction over. He freed the slaves in the South. He did not free the slaves in the northern states, the few that were there. He did not free slaves in areas that were already under Union control. He only freed the slaves that were still in Confederate controlled areas. And Lincoln famously said, "If I can preserve the Union and free none of the slaves, I will do that. If I can preserve the Union by freeing all of the slaves, I would also do that. And if I could preserve the Union and free some of the slaves, but not others, I would also do that." So we need to look at the history behind that. This idea of separate but equal in the Plessy versus Ferguson era of America, that was de jure segregation. The U.S. government upheld the idea that segregation was legal. Today, of course, that's been struck down ever since Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education in 1954, when Thurgood Marshall argued successfully before the court that there was no basic equality in segregation and separation. Thurgood Marshall, of course, later went on to become a justice of the Supreme Court. But today you still have the problem of de facto segregation. Yeah, it's not legal, it's not de jure segregation, but it's de facto. It happens all the time. People are intolerant, people are insensitive, people are ignorant, and as a result, people often differentiate on the basis of race or ethnicity or gender or sexuality. So during the time of Jim Crow laws in the South, some push and pull factors affected migration. We call it the Great Migration in U.S. history. And this is the movement of Black Americans after the Civil War, and especially after the 1900s, in the early decades of the 1900s, out of the South because of racial policies that were targeting them in the South. Those were the push factors. And then the pull factor of employment in big cities in the North. So there's this big migration out of the South. South Africa has a similar story, and Australia has a similar story with the indigenous Aboriginal people. So many countries in the world have problems between the charter group, the group that was there first, and the groups that have colonized and imperialized and moved in. Canada with their first Americans, South America with the indigenous people being wiped out by Spanish and Portuguese colonists in Latin America, and in particular with Brazil. So when you think about an apartheid system where South Africa had a white-only system up until the 1990s, that's a very recent example of how race-based politics can still exist in the modern world. Here's a map that shows you that basic pattern of the Great Migration, moving to cities of the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, which is why, if you remember all the way back in Unit 1, when we talked about the patterns of population and distribution in the United States, this is why we see African Americans living in big cities like New York and Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So even if we don't use race, what about if we talk about ethnicity? For a long time, people used to think of the idea of the word Hispanic as a race. It's not. Hispanics can be white, Hispanics can be black, Hispanics can be everything in between. And so when we think about Hispanic, we have a lot of migration from Latin America into the United States, both from South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. The 2010 census was the first census in American history that asked, if you answered yes, I'm Hispanic, it followed it up and said, okay, what country do you identify with being from? Is it Puerto Rican? Is it Mexican? Is it Cuban? Is it, Colombian, Venezuelan? So it's very interesting. The Greeks historically called the nationality of a people the ethnos. And so that was the ethnicity. It's based on common traits, a common history, a shared value system. You choose your nationality. You're born as a citizen of a certain state, a government, but you can choose to feel what area of the world you are from. Toponyms, of course, are a big part of this because place names reflect the values of the people who live in those areas. And ethnic groups oftentimes choose to live in certain ethnic neighborhoods where their children often go to the same schools. And again, that sometimes creates a bit of a problem because if you don't mix with people who are unlike you, it sometimes is hard to be tolerant of people who are different than you or perceived to be different than you. Many of you know that they have these new ancestry kits where you can order them and find out, your background. Mrs. Turner ordered one for me for my birthday one year. My grandmother had always told us that we had Native American heritage in our family. So I did the test. I sent it off. It came back. Lo and behold, there was zero Native American ancestry in my family. Shockingly, I had a lot of Irish and Scottish and English, and that's kind of typical of what I expected. There were a few little details, some Scandinavian, some Iberian, and I always used to wonder, is the Iberian, the Spanish, is that because of the Armada that attempted to invade the British Isles in the 1500s? If you don't know the story, after the defeat of the Spanish Armada, they sailed all the way around the British Isles, and they were hit by a horrific storm that destroyed many of the ships, and they ended up washed up on the shores of Ireland. And I wonder if maybe that's where some of my Spanish heritage comes from. In the United States, of course, you know that white Americans are projected not to be the majority for much longer. They will be a plurality, meaning that they're the most, but they're not going to be over 50%. And as a result, you see that Asian, African American, and Hispanic are all increasing. And of course, this changes everything from voting patterns. It changes the sports that kids play growing up. It changes what's being served at church picnics across America. It used to be hamburgers and hot dogs and apple pie. And now sometimes it's empanadas or it's sriracha sauce because of the immigration and because of the changing ethnic makeup of the communities. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It certainly enriches diversity. It enriches cultural experiences to have different food, listen to different music, be tolerant and be observant of other cultures. Schematic of cultural revival. This is something very similar to what you can see in Miami, particularly with Mrs. Turner's family who came from Cuba. When they were young adults. My mother-in-law was a teenager when she left Cuba. And oftentimes they move into an ethnic neighborhood. And it helps them to adjust because they're surrounded by people who are very much like themselves. But after a while, they start to move out of those ethnic neighborhoods as they learn English, as they get jobs. They move to places like, in my case, Orlando, which is where I met Mrs. Turner at University of Central Florida. And then in part B, you can see intermarriage. Mrs. Turner, who's 100% Cuban, both of her parents born in Cuba, all of her grandparents born in Cuba, marries a kid from Tennessee that had absolutely zero experience with Cubans, Cuban food, the language, the music, the guayabera, whatever it is. It was a cultural shock for me. But now, after almost 30 years of being married, I kind of feel like I'm almost more Cuban than I am Tennessean. And it's funny because when kids hear me speak Spanish, they'll say, "Mr. Turner, you sound Cuban when you speak Spanish." And I wonder, is that just the mimicry of what I hear, because the only Spanish I ever hear is Cuban Spanish. So then you get to part C, renewed links to the old neighborhood. And this is Michael and Katie, because even though they are Hispanic, even though they know they're Cuban, they embrace being Cuban, their Spanish isn't great. When they speak to bisabuela, it's a bit of a choppy, stop-start kind of a conversation. But when we go to Miami, we always try to make sure that they see, the older relatives. My son used to always go to visit the tias who were living in Miami when my in-laws would go to take care of the great aunts. And all of this is about this idea of cultural revival, getting back in touch with your roots. This is why your family probably wants you to remember where you come from and who you are as an identity. This is a great little map. It shows Miami, and it shows a lot of the ethnic neighborhoods and the little pockets of differentiation that exist in a big American city, and almost all big American cities are like this to some degree.